So I'd like to welcome Mr. Ainur Kurmanov, Chairman of the Human Rights Organization Talmas, to our meeting today. And as I said, he is with us today in spite of great difficulties and personal danger. And Господин Kurmanov, вы можете...
Mr. Kurmanov, you can speak Russian.
Спасибо.
Thank you very much. It is a great honor for me to speak to you on behalf of the Talmas organization, on behalf of the independent trade unions, the human rights movement resisting arbitrary abuse of power, and the coalition of civil and grassroots movements known as Kazakhstan 2012. I'd like to present a rather different opposition point of view to the official propaganda and statements of the government of Kazakhstan that Kazakhstan is moving apparently at lightning speed towards democracy and that there has been liberalization of all our legislation. These assurances have absolutely nothing to do with what is going on the ground, and none of the promises made by representatives of the government to the OSCE in Madrid in 2007 has been implemented. This is to do with freedom of the assembly, free and fair elections, freedom of speech, and freedom of association and freedom of political activity. Despite the fact that in the Constitution it does mention freedom of peaceful assembly, in reality, in 90% of cases, the authorities refuse the right to any parties or trade unions to conduct peaceful rallies or strikes. Any activists who do demonstrate without permission are subject to fines and arrests, and this is something that I have gone through this year and last on several occasions. Only this year alone, dozens of trade union activists have been sacked, which are part of our movement, part of our organizations that I read out and that I represent. This year as well, with the active participation of the authorities, trade union representatives have been sacked, apparently because of participation in illegal strikes. Opposition political parties cannot register, for example, the OSDP Assad and the People's Party Alga, which probably won't be able to participate in the forthcoming parliamentary elections. Freedom of use of the internet is limited by a punitive law. All the bloggers and participators in chats are equated to journalists and the media. A series of opposition sites are blocked, as the other rapporteurs have said. The Respublika newspaper cannot be printed anywhere because of a ban on the part of the authorities. And I have here the Respublika newspaper, which is now coming out in an underground basis. So no printing house in the country, because of the pressure of the authorities, is able to print this opposition paper. There is also pressure on the Stan TV video portal, which is being threatened with closure on the part of the tax and finance authorities. There are hundreds of prisoners in Kazakhstan who've been accused of terrorist and extremist activity, although according to official data there haven't been any terrorist acts. But all these people who are in prison, all they've been guilty of is being part of Islamic movements, which are all peaceful in character. The authorities in Kazakhstan are also infringing the Convention of the EU on the status of refugees. 29 Uzbek refugees were arrested in June by the special forces and will be extradited to Uzbekistan, where they are bound to be killed. At the same time, in Kazakhstan, tobacco companies and companies growing cotton resort to child labor on a mass basis, and this is being documented by Human Rights Watch, and you've heard about this today. That report is also, by the way, banned in Kazakhstan, and the site on which you would find this report is blocked in the country. The authorities have also restricted the right to education of children of labor migrants because they cannot register. For its own citizens, it has also reintroduced the residence permit, the propiska, which restricts people's right to move around in the country, and it is more discriminatory even than it was in the old USSR. I'd like to tell you about the rights of prisoners in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan has shown that it hasn't moved in terms of degrading treatment and torture much from the Stalinist Gulag system, which existed in the Stalinist times. There are so-called groups of internal law enforcement within these colonies or prisons, which are recruited by convicted prisoners, convicted criminals who are used to enforce order within the prisons. And this year there has been so much persecution, abuse and torture that a lot of prisoners have resorted to self-harming. And as an act of protest on the 9th of August, for example, because of the mass use of methods which come from Nazi concentration camps, such as constant marching around the quad in extremes of heat and cold and constant singing of the anthem, there was an uprising in a prison where there are non-dangerous prisoners held. There was a mass protest, and as a result, these troops were sent in. Some prisoners committed harakiri, slitting themselves open, and several died, and one poured petrol over himself and immolated himself. The authorities are still denying exactly how many people died in this protest. Despite the declarations of the government on humanization and liberalization of the prison system, we have seen things only moving backwards in this respect. Human rights defenders are publishing the notes of prisoners who've died, the notes they've written before they died, and they show that there's been so much torture in these prison colonies in Kazakhstan, but nobody has been punished for any of these things within the prison system. The killings of Kutin, Moldakhanov, Muhammad Kaliev, the driving to suicide of Kazhanov has never led to anyone being punished as a result. The resistance to the abuse of power organization was led by a human rights defender, Kuramshin, who spent 6 years in prison for so-called slander. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to come to this meeting because of fears for his own safety, for his own life. But we have here his full report on the situation in the prisons in Kazakhstan, which we can hand on to you. I'd like to turn now to political repression. In Kazakhstani prisons, there are political prisoners such as the editor of a newspaper, Esirgepov, who apparently is accused of divulging state secrets, and a writer and poet, Atabek, who tried to uphold the rights of internal migrants and was put in prison for that. There have been systematic provocations of social organizations by the forces of law and order. Often they're attacked by the police and then themselves are accused of being hooligans or resisting arrest. Aidus Sadikov was beaten up by an ex-policeman in May this year and sentenced to 2 years, being accused of breach of the peace. There is a video and photographs of him being beaten up which prove that he is innocent, but that the Kazakhstan courts will not look at these, and we have all this information and video materials here which we can show to you, anyone who's interested. The same thing happened to a human rights defender Arman, Yermik Marbiev, who was sentenced to 4 years, accused of attacking the police and offending a judge. All he did, in fact, was participate in a protest with a banner saying, "Nazarbayev, go." He has entered into a 50-day hunger strike, asking the courts to look at this video material, which has proved his innocence, but they will not allow even his relatives near him, let alone his lawyers. Hooliganism was the accusation as well against Igor Korlev, who is a trade union activist, who was severely beaten, his ribs were broken, and he is now under administrative arrest. The police apparently lost his complaint about being beaten up, and they kept him in for an extra 15 days to make sure the bruises disappeared, and then they put him in a police car and, unknown to his relatives or lawyers, took him out of town and dumped him there without any money. The well-known human rights defender Kuramshin was arrested in August, and the only reason for putting him in jail for 10 days was to stop him meeting Joe Higgins, one of the MEPs here. And yet there are so many real offences of physical attacks and terrorist acts against opposition parties, against members of the media and independent trade unions, which go unpunished. Tahir Muhamedzyanov, who is part of a trade union movement, had his car blown up, and then they tried to put him in a psychiatric institution. After investigations, the doctors in fact refused to certify him for a psychiatric institution, and he was released. But the authorities in his area are still trying to confiscate his flat. And he has also been beaten up and physically attacked, so he is very much in danger. Dozens of activists of the oilmen's trade union have been attacked. 2 of them are still in hospital. There was an attack on me before the OSCE session last year, but they never found the attackers. The offices of the Communist Party were set on fire in Uralsk the other day, but they'll never find any of the perpetrators. Drugs were planted in the office of the trade union representative Kashanov, and 8,000 oilmen went on strike to defend his rights. And this is still ongoing, in fact. He has in fact been freed now, but they haven't dropped the case, and at any moment they could throw him back in jail. With regard to dissidents and trade union organisers, activists of human rights defence organisations, there is constant terrorism and repression, despite the fact that Kazakhstan is in the chairmanship of the OSCE. In conclusion, I would like to say that there are so many NGO representatives who come to our country, human rights defenders, special rapporteurs on torture, on freedom of the media, on decent housing, but they look at human rights questions in a very narrow format, and none of the political institutions or human rights defenders have actually carried out a systematic analysis of the global changes and deterioration in the freedoms and human rights situation in Kazakhstan. If you look at the 50 paragraphs of the European Charter on Human Rights, on at least 44 of those, the situation has gone downhill in Kazakhstan. For example, citizens don't have the right to receive information. Kazakhstan are now 162nd in terms of our attitude to the media, whereas last year we were 125th, according to Rapporteurs Sans Frontières. The last thing I'd like to say is that the authorities have said anyone can stand for election, but this year they passed a law on the leader of the nation which virtually gives life tenure to President Nazarbayev, including the right to veto any other decisions about his successor. So reality doesn't tally at all with any of the declarations made by the authorities. Thank you.